Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reading Richard Reeves' of Boys and Men. Unfortunately, I don't have a cover to share with you this week. I did read it on ebook. I did review Richard Reeves' Dream Hoarders last week, so if you want to check out a quick biography of Richard Reeves, it's there. This book, I'll go over what it's about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Boys and Men is based on the premise that men and boys in the United States specifically are falling behind in educational achievement, falling behind in the workforce, and falling behind in parental roles. And Richard Reeves goes into pretty painstaking detail as far as his research to show you why that's true. For instance, in K through 12 education, women are graduating at a rate higher, about 6% higher than men from high school, and then in college, for every one degree, bachelor's degree that a man earns, women earn 2 of them, and they've basically reached parity in terms of graduate level for many grad degrees as well as PhD levels. So men have been, over the last 40 years, have been not able to match that pace and are in the workforce, falling out of the workforce. So the employment rate for men, I think in prime working ages, I think he says 25 to 55 or something like that, is basically much lower. There's like 5 million missing men from the workforce. We don't know what they're doing with their lives, why they're not taking some of these other jobs that are available to them, and it's kind of a persistent problem. And then the caretaking roles, he kind of mentions statistics that that children are much more likely to be born out of wedlock than they were 50 years ago, and family formations are not where they were back then. So he does that. I like the chapters. He basically sets up those problems. He says, here are the problems that men are having. He then goes on to say, here are the solutions to these problems as I see them. In between, he talks about the political divide between conservatives and liberals as they view the problems of gender disparities. He has a chapter about black men specifically because they are in a specific category where a lot of these problems are exacerbated in the black and African American community. Then finally, he goes on to talk about, not finally, but he also talks about deaths of despair, which is, the Angus Deacon and his wife, whose name escapes me at the moment, their paper that came out a few years ago showing the rise of deaths by overdose and by suicide, specifically in the problem has increased across the board, but the problems are much worse for men who are middle-aged or older. And so that's the book, really. It basically is, here are the problems, here are some specific areas where there's been research done, here's the biological research that's being done on the differences between men and women that may exacerbate this problem, and here are my solutions. So I did like that it's laid out very cleanly. I like the chapter on deaths of despair quite a bit. I like the chapter on the political divide of left and right quite a bit. He kind of goes into toxic masculinity, and he goes into areas where the COVID-19 crisis was something I had not known about. Men were much more higher. I think it's 50% more likely to have died from COVID. And he kind of touches on these things in a way that I thought were really laid out well. He talks about how there's been a lot of programs that have been designed, that are gender-neutral programs that have been designed to try to help men and women complete college, and they've been very, very successful for women, but they haven't been successful for men. We don't really know why that is, but he kind of goes over that. So I liked that he had a lot of research done for this book, and he clearly has done his work on it, and he uses a lot of sources, and I think the book flows very well. I think that he inserts himself a couple times like he did in Dream Hoarders, but I was less annoyed by it here. So overall, I liked the writing. I thought it moved at a pretty good clip. I actually really like some of his solutions, which I'll get to in a minute. So overall, I like this book more than Dream Hoarders. My issues with it were a few, mostly dealing with his solutions. He does play a little fast and loose with the facts again here in one or two places, I noticed. But I did think he was able to use the statistics and examples he used in this book, I thought clearly illustrated his points. There are times where he doesn't come back to fully explain things, or to rectify or to wrestle with some of those things, but I'll get to in a minute. The book has, as far as the cons, the book has a focus on, similar to Dream Hoarders, it has a focus on people who are raising children. For instance, he talks about the deaths of despairs, and you see in deaths of despairs that the group that's most impacted by it, like I said before, the older, you'd call middle-aged or older folks whose rates of death by suicide or drug overdose have increased much, much more than any other group. He doesn't really focus on solutions for those folks. He does focus a lot on education, and he focuses a lot on workforce solutions, but he doesn't really focus on that group. I understand why he included it in the book, just to show you, here's an example where there's a problem that really we as a society have really ignored and not done anything to work towards to solve. And I understand why he did that. I wish he had had maybe solutions or something for that group in particular. So what were the cons and what did I not like? And so when he's laying out his argument for the education achievement, he notices that, there are 3/4 of teachers are women. He mentions that the achievement gap in high school graduation is about 6 points. And he says that he has a long section of biological differences between men and women. And then he also, his big solution, probably the most controversial thing about his solutions for this book is in terms of education, but really for the entire book, is something called redshirting. And he wrote an article, I think it was in the Atlantic not too long ago, and I'll try to post it below if I can find it. But his premise is basically because men and women, really boys and girls, mature at different speeds, it would be helpful for boys to take a year out before they start kindergarten to basically have a second year of pre-K. To the best of my knowledge, and again, as I said before, I don't have children, but we don't have a universal pre-K program, and his idea would be to create a universal pre-K program, have girls go for at least 1 year and boys go for 2 years before entering kindergarten. What he argues is, and there's been a little bit of research on it, there hasn't been research to the point where even he, I think, admits this would be something you would need to do some sample sizes on before doing this writ large. There's also the question he doesn't really ever get around to, well, if this is beneficial to men, would it also not be beneficial to women? And you can't really force them not to do this. So anyway, he doesn't really wrestle with that due to Title IX and sex discrimination, all kinds of things. But that's his idea, is to basically redshirt all the boys so they start school, what we call K through 12 education, a year later, and this will give them an extra year to develop their listening skills and their aggressions and emotions a little bit better. So my problem with that is, beyond the idea of having universal pre-K and having the cost of that, or having the cost for that for 1 year for women and 2 years for men, or 1 year for boys, 2 years for girls, it doesn't really go a step deeper, in my opinion, and ask if there's possibly a cultural reason for this that we can maybe change, or are there biases that are in the system against men that we could maybe look at and rectify through training. Because to me, that would make more sense than his reason, which is to say, since Title IX ended, women have really outpaced men in a really extreme way in the last 50 years. And he shows that statistically to be true. The issue I have with that is if that were true and the difference is strictly biological, if there were cultural barriers to women before we removed those barriers, I would have expected these numbers to have jumped up much, much sooner. And it seems that they have taken time for them to jump up. And it's not clear to me why that is, if the only reason it is biological. He doesn't really wrestle with that, in my opinion. And so there's that. That is his big reason for big idea to fix education. The idea that I agree with him about, and I think is really pertinent, is the lack of vocational training in high school specifically. He says there are about 7,000 vocational high schools in America, and they give men and boys the ability to get real training with their hands and able to go into occupations that need those things. And he actually makes a really strong argument for them, in my opinion. He says there's only about 12% of places where 12% of, I think, counties where this is available to men. Well, to everybody, but men specifically, because that's who he's targeting for this book. And I thought that made a lot of sense. It would be relatively inexpensive given some of the costs of the other programs he's put forward. And that would maybe be something that there would be political consensus on, because you can make the argument from the left, if we're able to train these people, train more men to go into these fields, that are spatially related, it's possible that they would use those skills to go into things like clean energy, which are jobs that we're going to need in the future if we ever get something off the ground, like a Make America Green Again or Green New Deal, whatever. And so, so there's that. And he didn't really touch on that political consensus part. That was me editorializing. But that, to me, would be the reason. You also, the obvious thing to me, when you're trying to, and this is just me editorializing again, if you're trying to close the gap between high school education or high school achievement and the graduation rate is a difference about 6%, people could argue how big of a difference 6% is, I guess. But the point being, if you had a shop class for someone to go to, people will sit through a lot of things they don't want to do in order to get to the thing they really want to do. And so the pulling out of resources for things like shop and tech, I think are one of the reasons there are a lot of, you have this achievement gap in a lot of places. So, and then finally, the other solution he has for the workforce is to, in the same way that there has been a push for STEM education, STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math, he says we need an equal push for men for what he calls HEAL, which is health, education, administration, and literacy. This is kind of where he veered off the road for me, because I was like on board with the vocational training, and that to me made sense. But his arguments are basically, in the future, these are jobs that are going to grow, and we're going to need more workers in these fields because they're going to be the most in-demand fields. He does acknowledge the wages for STEM are higher on average than these jobs. When I was reading this, I said to myself, well, you're still going to need to go to college to get into these jobs. And these jobs aren't new jobs. Like, nurses have been around for a long time. Education teachers have been around for a long time. Administrators have been around for a long time. So I didn't really understand why a man who was like, I don't know if I want to go to college, why would he join? It wasn't clear to me why he would, if he had the option to go to college and get a job that paid a lot, or like business, or if he wanted to go into computer science where he could make like 140 a few years after graduating, why he would eschew those jobs to go into these other jobs. Because they weren't new jobs, and these things have lasted for a long time, and part of the reason that I think men don't go into them is because they pay lower and they're not prestigious. And he touches on it a little bit, but I don't think he ever really fully, there wasn't really anything when I read this that I was like, I don't really see the hook to these jobs for men. Like it was, if they're not doing them now, why would they do them in the future? And it wasn't clear to me what the reason for that would be, other than to say, he says we need that. And he does point out there is a huge funding disparity. They spent billions and billions of dollars to push women into tech, and whether or not you feel that that's appropriate or not appropriate, it doesn't really matter. That's what has happened. And he basically says we need an equal push towards men. And I think the underlying point of the whole book, I think, is that just politically, and he repeats this point again and again, politically, the idea that men are not performing equal to women is really anathema to a lot of people. And that, to me, is really the biggest stigma and point that it's going to be difficult for him to get across. He talks about the wage gap, which is something that people talk about all the time. He gives evidence that I've seen before, and evidence I believe that the wage gap is largely, if you account for things like overtime and years in the workforce and education, it's really minimal. It's like 3% or 2% if it exists at all. So that's not how it's often used. But he does cite examples where there's been studies that have done that shows that the wage gap may be something of a myth, which I appreciated. So yeah, I think overall it is an interesting book. I think this is another book that would really be good for book clubs. And I think this would be something that you could have a lot of conversation about. I think there are issues that I agreed with. There are issues where I didn't agree with. The HEAL thing, to me, he kind of talks about this push for vocational training. I'm like, yeah, right on, because I do think that that's missing in a lot of places and would give men an opportunity to do the things that I think they're more biologically suited to do in terms of spatial skills, in terms of working with their hands, in terms of working in mostly male environments, because men seem to be drawn to these more than women are. And I was like, okay, well, why is that a bad thing? And I think for him to push the HEAL, he does mention the vocational training, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, that it's for him a separate thing. But it seemed to be that one was more geared towards the education. If we have vocational schools, this will help education obtainment and help men get into roles that are as highly paid as college degrees, roles that require college education, but take much less formal education. And to me, it's like, the roles that you're talking about for these heal roles are either take a lot of education, don't pay particularly well, and I don't think, and again, he gets into biological differences between men and women and how much of that is exaggerated and how much of that there's some kernels of truth to. And, you could go back and forth with that stuff all day. But I think overall I enjoyed the book. I thought it was a good jumping off point for a lot of discussion like Dream Hoarders was. I think this I think was done a little bit better. I think there may be people who read this and take umbrage with just the overall, where's the problem here? You had men outperforming women for a long time. Now you have women outperforming men. If they can't hang, they can't hang. What's the issue? And he doesn't ever really grasp or grapple with that, I will say. I never really got, I think we want men to be able to be in the workforce fully. And I think we want men to have jobs that they respect and feel that they bring something to a family. But there didn't really seem to be a lot of discussion as far as like heterosexual couples and how they navigate those waters if women make more than men. And he doesn't really touch that at all. He basically says, there may be situations where women make more than men, and I don't know what's going to happen. And you're like, well, is that a cultural conversation that needs to be happening if we've accepted that men are just not going to be fully in the workforce at all times? Or are we just maybe putting too much emphasis on having kids in this book? And are people just not going to have as many kids? And again, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? So again, there's a lot of interesting points in this book, and I think you can get a lot out of it, and I think it would be a good discussion for book club. And so I recommend it to people who are interested in social sciences. I recommend it to people who haven't really maybe thought about this book, this topic a lot. I recommend it to people who have maybe not looked at the wage gap very deeply and not looked at some of these other things. I also recommend it for educators. The reason I do is because I think he lets educators off the hook, quite frankly, and doesn't go any deeper than basically saying, yeah, 3/4 of the teachers are women and boys are really aggressive, and just that may be just the reason that they don't achieve things as well. And to his credit, when he doesn't know things, and he says multiple times in the book, we can't really explain the gap, the dropout gap for college students, for men college students and female college students. Men seem to get to college at relatively high rates, but then they drop out at much higher rates. And it's not clear to anybody why that is. And kind of similar with the K through 12 education. I think that there's some educated guesses, but there doesn't seem to be any real reasons other than his point is men just develop slower. Again, I would ask, well, why has that changed so much in the last 50 years? And he doesn't really have, in my opinion, he doesn't really answer that question. But I think that it's good for discussion, and I think that there are a lot of people who would enjoy this quite a bit. And I realize I've now gone pretty long on this, so I'll just wrap it up by saying I will actually be reviewing. I'm going to try to get my hands on Adrift, which is a book written by Scott Galloway, which deals with similar topics. He comes more from a tech background, and I think his book is more about what this means for the culture at large in terms of the American identity. And Richard Reeves doesn't really touch on that. He really touches on more of what does this mean for individuals and society, but not really so much for like the American experience. But I'm going to try to get my hands on that. Until that, though, I'm going to be reading Summer Suns by Lee Mandello. I should have that up in about a week. If you have read Boys and Men, please let me know. I'm interested to hear different opinions about it. And please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And you can follow me on Twitter. I'll leave that link below. I'll also leave the link to Dream Hoarders below. Until next time, bye.